Ashenmeres Trials. To end a brutal war, Lady Emmeline of Briarhall was ordered to wed Lord Nicholas Warwick, the man who had burned her family's lands. But when they met at the altar, his gaze burned hotter than any fire. He reached for her, his fingers curling around her wrist. "You hate me now, my lady," he murmured. "I wonder how long that will last." Chapter 1. The King's Decree. The parchment felt cold and brittle beneath Emmeline's fingertips, the royal seal of King Alaric a heavy, crimson stain against the stark white. Each word, penned in the precise, unforgiving hand of the royal scribe, seemed to sear itself into her very soul. A marriage. Not of love, not of alliance, but of subjugation. A binding of two warring houses, sealed not with affection but with the bitter taste of defeat. She, Lady Emmeline of Briarhall, was to wed Lord Nicholas Warwick, the very man who had laid waste to her family's lands, leaving a trail of fire and sorrow in his wake. The great hall of Briarhall, once a place of laughter and warmth, now felt like a tomb. The tapestries depicting the proud history of her lineage, the stags rampant against a field of emerald green, seemed to mock her with their silent defiance. The scent of smoke, a phantom lingering from Warwick's siege, clung to the very stones, a constant reminder of her family's humiliation. Her brother, Thomas, stood beside her, his youthful face etched with a fury that mirrored her own, but tempered with the weary resignation of a defeated leader. "He dares," Thomas hissed, his hand clenched around the hilt of his sword, the knuckles bone white. "He dares demand this of us, after all he has done." Emmeline raised a hand, a gesture meant to soothe, though her own heart throbbed with a rebellion that threatened to choke her. "It is the King's decree, Thomas. We have no choice." Her voice was steady, betraying none of the turmoil within. She had learned, in the crucible of war, to mask her emotions, to present a facade of unwavering strength, even as her world crumbled around her. "The king is a fool," Thomas spat, his words echoing in the vast, silent hall. Blind to Warwick's treachery, to his insatiable hunger for power. Emmeline knew the truth of his words. King Alaric, weakened by years of conflict, craved peace at any cost. And the cost, in this instance, was her future, her happiness, her very self. She was to be the sacrificial lamb, offered up to appease the Warwick wolf. The thought sent a shiver of ice down her spine, a premonition of the cold, unforgiving life that awaited her. She glanced out the tall, arched windows, towards the rolling hills of Briarhall, once vibrant and green, now scarred with blackened patches, testament to Warwick's brutal efficiency. The memory of the flames, reaching towards the sky like grasping claws, the screams of her people, the acrid smell of burning wood and flesh, rose unbidden in her mind. How could she ever share a bed, a life, with the man responsible for such devastation? "He will expect an obedient wife," Thomas said, his voice laced with a bitterness that mirrored her own. "A broodmare to bear his heirs, to secure his claim on Briarhall." Emmeline's jaw tightened. She would be no man's broodmare. She would meet this challenge as she had met every other, with her head held high, her spirit unbroken. She would find a way to survive, to protect her people, even within the enemy's stronghold. Later that day, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, mournful shadows across the ravaged landscape, Emmeline sought solace in the small, stone chapel that stood nestled within the castle walls. The scent of beeswax and incense filled the air, a fragile comfort in a world consumed by chaos. She knelt before the altar, her fingers tracing the worn carvings of the saints, their faces serene and unwavering in the flickering candlelight. "Grant me strength," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rustling of her skirts. "Grant me the courage to face this darkness, to protect my people, to preserve my honor." She closed her eyes, seeking a moment of peace, a respite from the storm raging within her. But even in prayer, the image of Nicholas Warwick, the man she was to marry, intruded. She had seen him only once from afar during the siege. A figure clad in black armor, astride a massive warhorse, his face obscured by a visored helmet, a symbol of destruction, of unrelenting power. Yet, in the depths of her hatred, a flicker of something else stirred. Curiosity, perhaps, or a morbid fascination with the man who held her fate in his hands. She had heard tales of his prowess in battle, of his ruthless ambition, but also of a certain magnetism, a dark charisma that drew people to him, even as they feared him. A sudden sound, the creak of the chapel door, startled her. She turned, her heart pounding, to see her old nurse, Agnes, standing in the doorway, her face etched with worry. "My lady," Agnes said, her voice hushed with concern. "The Warwick envoy has arrived. They await you in the hall." Emmeline rose, smoothing the wrinkles from her gown, a simple garment of dark blue wool, chosen deliberately to convey a sense of mourning, of defiance. She would not greet her future husband adorned in silks and jewels, as if this were a celebration. She would meet him as a prisoner of war, a pawn in a game of power. As she walked towards the great hall, her steps measured and deliberate, she felt a strange sense of detachment, as if she were watching herself from afar. This was not her life, not the future she had envisioned. But it was the reality she had been dealt, and she would face it with the dignity and courage befitting a lady of Briar Hall. The great hall was ablaze with torchlight, the flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. The Warwick envoy, a stern-faced man with a hawk-like nose and eyes that seemed to pierce through her, stood before the hearth, flanked by 2 heavily armed guards. He bowed stiffly as she approached. "Lady Emmeline," he said, his voice devoid of warmth, "I bring greetings from Lord Nicholas Warwick. He awaits your arrival at Castle Draken. The wedding is to take place in 3 days' time." 3 days. A mere blink of an eye to prepare for a life she had never wanted, a marriage she dreaded. But Emmeline showed no outward sign of her dismay. She simply nodded, her expression unreadable. "I will be ready," she said, her voice clear and steady. The envoy bowed again, and then, with a curt nod to his guards, he turned and left. The heavy oak doors of the hall slammed shut behind him, the sound echoing like a death knell. Emmeline felt her brother's hand on her arm and turned her gaze towards him. The despair in his eyes was a mirror image of her own, but now, in Addison, she saw something she hadn't before. Hope. It seemed impossible, but it was undeniably there. "Be careful, sister," he said, squeezing her hand. "Be very careful. The Wolf of Warwick has sharp teeth. Do not forget, however, so does the Stag of Briar Hall." Chapter 2. A vow forged in fire. The journey to Castle Draken was a blur of wind-whipped landscapes and silent, watchful guards. Emmeline, wrapped in a heavy cloak of grey wool, sat stiffly in the carriage, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The rolling hills of Briar Hall gradually gave way to the more rugged, forbidding terrain of the Warwick lands. Jagged peaks pierced the sky, their summits shrouded in mist, and dark forests pressed close to the road, their depths concealing untold secrets. The air itself seemed heavier here, charged with a sense of ancient power and brooding menace. She had refused any elaborate escort, choosing instead to travel with only a handful of her most trusted retainers, including Agnes and a small contingent of Briar Hall guards, their faces grim and resolute. Thomas had wanted to accompany her, but she had insisted he remain at Briar Hall to safeguard their lands and their people. Their parting had been brief, their emotions raw and unspoken. A fierce hug, a whispered promise of vengeance, and then she was gone, swallowed up by the vastness of the Warwick domain. As the carriage rattled along the rough, winding road, Emmeline's thoughts drifted back to the stories she had heard about Castle Draken. It was said to be an impregnable fortress, built upon the ruins of an ancient stronghold, its walls rising sheer from the cliffs, its towers piercing the sky like the claws of a dragon. It was a place of legends, of whispered tales of dark magic and brutal battles. A fitting lair for the Warwick wolf. The closer they drew to their destination, the more palpable the tension became. The guards, who had been stoic and silent throughout the journey, now gripped their weapons more tightly, their eyes scanning the surrounding landscape for any sign of threat. Emmeline, too, felt a knot of apprehension tighten in her stomach. She was entering enemy territory, placing herself at the mercy of a man she had every reason to despise. Finally, as the sun began to set, casting long, fiery streaks across the sky, Castle Draken came into view. It was even more imposing than she had imagined. A colossal structure of dark gray stone, it seemed to grow out of the very rock upon which it was built, its walls scarred with the marks of countless sieges, its towers reaching towards the heavens like defiant fists. The sight of it sent a shiver of unease down her spine, but she forced herself to maintain a calm exterior, her face an impassive mask. The carriage rumbled across a drawbridge, spanning a deep chasm that yawned beneath, and passed through a massive gatehouse, its iron portcullis raised in a gesture of grudging welcome. The courtyard within was a hive of activity. Soldiers in Warwick livery, their faces hardened by war, went about their duties, their eyes lingering on Emmeline and her retinue with undisguised curiosity and suspicion. The air was thick with the smell of horses, wood smoke, and the metallic tang of the nearby forge. A steward, a thin, weasel-faced man with a nervous demeanor, approached the carriage as it came to a halt. He bowed low, his eyes avoiding Emmeline's gaze. "Lady Emmeline," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "Lord Nicholas awaits you in the great hall." Emmeline stepped down from the carriage, her movements graceful and deliberate, despite the tremor of fear that ran through her. She gathered her cloak around her, a shield against the cold and the prying eyes of the Warwick soldiers. As she followed the steward through the labyrinthine corridors of the castle, she couldn't help but feel a sense of disorientation, of being lost in a maze of stone and shadow. The great hall of Castle Draken was even more imposing than that of Briar Hall. It was larger, darker, more austere. The walls were adorned with tapestries depicting scenes of battle and conquest, the Warwick banner, a snarling wolf's head on a field of black, prominently displayed. A massive fireplace dominated one end of the hall, a roaring fire casting flickering shadows on the faces of the assembled courtiers. And there, standing before the hearth, his back to the flames, was Lord Nicholas Warwick. He was taller than she had remembered, his broad shoulders and powerful frame filling the space before him. He was dressed in black, as she had seen him before, but this time his face was not obscured. It was a face that commanded attention, a face etched with both strength and a hint of weariness. His eyes, a piercing shade of gray, met hers, and for a moment, the world seemed to fade away. There was a stillness in the hall, a palpable tension that hung in the air like a shroud. Emmeline felt her heart pounding against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence. She met his gaze unflinchingly, refusing to show any sign of weakness, any hint of the fear that gnawed at her. He took a step towards her, his movements fluid and graceful, like those of a predator stalking its prey. The firelight glinted off the silver wolf's head pendant that hung around his neck, a symbol of his lineage, his power. "Lady Emmeline," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very stones of the hall. "Welcome to Draken." His words were polite, but there was an undercurrent of something else, a hint of challenge, of possessiveness, that sent a shiver down her spine. She inclined her head slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement, but offered no words in return. He gestured towards a raised dais, where 2 chairs had been placed before a small altar. "The priest awaits," he said. "Let us not delay the inevitable." Emmeline followed him to the dais, her steps measured and deliberate. The priest, a thin, nervous man with a wispy beard, began the ceremony, his voice trembling slightly as he recited the ancient vows. The words seemed to echo in the vast hall, binding her to this man, this enemy, for all eternity. When it came time for her to speak, Emmeline's voice was clear and steady, betraying none of the turmoil within. "I, Emmeline of Briar Hall, take thee, Nicholas Warwick, to be my wedded husband." As she spoke the words, she felt a strange sense of unreality, as if she were watching herself from afar, a puppet in a play she had not chosen. But there was also a flicker of defiance, a refusal to be broken by this forced union. She would not be a passive victim. She would find a way to survive, to protect her people, even within the enemy's stronghold. When the ceremony was complete, Nicholas turned to her, his gray eyes intense and unreadable. He reached for her hand, his fingers curling around hers, their warmth a stark contrast to the coldness of the stone floor beneath her feet. "You hate me now, my lady," he murmured, his voice so low that only she could hear.
"I wonder how long that will last."
His touch, the unexpected warmth, the husky timbre of his voice for a moment, it shattered the carefully crafted mask she had worn. Beneath the layers of hatred and distrust, something stirred, unexpected. It was terrifying. It was magnetic. He raised her hand to his lips, his breath warm against her skin, and placed a chaste kiss upon her knuckles. A gesture of possession, of dominance. But also, perhaps, a hint of something else. A challenge? A promise? She could not tell. All that would be revealed in the long game of marriage that lay ahead. The assembled guests began a song. A wedding song, to be sure, but it sounded like a battle dirge in Emmeline's ears. Chapter 3. The Warwick Wolf. The wedding feast was a lavish affair, a display of Warwick wealth and power that seemed designed to both impress and intimidate. Tables laden with roasted meats, glistening fruits, and overflowing flagons of wine stretched the length of the great hall. Musicians played lively tunes, their melodies echoing off the high, vaulted ceiling, but the atmosphere remained strained, the conversation muted. The Warwick courtiers, a mix of battle-hardened warriors and elegantly dressed ladies, eyed Emmeline with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion, their whispers barely concealed. Emmeline sat beside Nicholas at the high table, her posture rigid, her appetite non-existent. She picked at the food on her plate, a delicate pastry filled with spiced pheasant, but her stomach churned with a mixture of nerves and resentment. She was acutely aware of Nicholas's presence beside her, the heat radiating from his body, the occasional brush of his arm against hers as he reached for the wine goblet. He, on the other hand, seemed to be enjoying himself. He ate with gusto, drank deeply, and engaged in boisterous conversation with his men, his laughter echoing through the hall. He was the center of attention, the undisputed lord of his domain, and he reveled in it. Emmeline observed him carefully, trying to decipher the man behind the mask of power. He was undeniably handsome, in a rugged, dangerous way. His dark hair, streaked with silver at the temples, framed a face that was both strong and subtly vulnerable. His gray eyes, when they weren't fixed on her with that unnerving intensity, held a hint of melancholy, a shadow of past sorrows that she couldn't quite understand. He was a warrior. That much was evident. His hands, calloused and scarred, bore testament to countless battles. But he was also a nobleman, educated and refined, capable of quoting poetry and discussing philosophy with the castle's resident scholar, a frail, elderly man named Master Alaric. As the evening wore on, Emmeline found herself drawn into conversation with some of the Warwick ladies. They were surprisingly courteous, even friendly, though she sensed a certain guardedness beneath their polite smiles. They spoke of their lives at Castle Draken, of their children, of the challenges of managing a large household. They seemed to accept her, albeit cautiously, as their new lady. One lady, in particular, caught Emmeline's attention. Lady Isolde, a tall, elegant woman with striking silver hair and piercing blue eyes, was Nicholas's aunt, his mother's sister. She was a widow, her husband having died in battle some years before, and she held a position of considerable influence within the Warwick household. "Welcome to Draken, Lady Emmeline," Isolde said, her voice smooth and cultured. "I hope you will find some measure of happiness here." Emmeline met her gaze, trying to discern any hidden meaning behind her words. "Thank you, Lady Isolde," she replied, her voice neutral. "I am sure I will adjust in time." Isolde smiled, a faint, knowing smile that sent a shiver of unease down Emmeline's spine. "Draken is a place of secrets," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "It takes time to understand its ways, its people." Emmeline nodded, her curiosity piqued. What secrets did Draken hold? And what role did Isolde play in them? Later, as the feast drew to a close, Nicholas rose to address the assembled guests. He raised his goblet, his voice ringing out through the hall. "To my bride," he said, his gaze locking with Emmeline's. "To Lady Emmeline of Briarhall. May this union bring peace and prosperity to our lands." The courtiers cheered, raising their goblets in response, but Emmeline felt a knot of unease tighten in her stomach. His words sounded hollow, empty of any genuine emotion. This was not a union of love, but of conquest, a means to an end. As the guests began to disperse, Nicholas turned to Emmeline, his expression unreadable. "It is time, my lady," he said, his voice low and intimate. "Time for us to retire." Emmeline's heart pounded against her ribs. The thought of sharing a bed with this man, this enemy, filled her with a mixture of dread and a strange, unsettling anticipation. She rose from her chair, her movements stiff and awkward, and followed him from the hall. They walked in silence through the long, dimly lit corridors of the castle, their footsteps echoing on the stone floors. The air was cold and heavy, the silence broken only by the crackling of the torches that lined the walls. Emmeline felt a sense of isolation, of being utterly alone in this vast, unfamiliar place. Finally, they reached a large, imposing door, guarded by 2 heavily armed soldiers. Nicholas nodded to the guards, and they opened the door, revealing a spacious, richly appointed chamber. A fire burned brightly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls, and a large, four-poster bed, draped in heavy velvet curtains, dominated the room. Emmeline stepped inside, her senses overwhelmed by the opulence of the surroundings. This was Nicholas's chamber, his private sanctuary, and she felt like an intruder, an unwelcome guest. He closed the door behind them, the sound echoing like a thunderclap in the silence. He turned to her, his gray eyes intense and unreadable. "You are afraid," he said, his voice a low murmur. It was not a question, but a statement of fact. Emmeline lifted her chin, refusing to show any sign of weakness. "I am not afraid of you, Lord Warwick," she said, her voice steady, though her heart betrayed her with its frantic beating. He smiled, a slow, predatory smile that sent a shiver down her spine.
"Perhaps not," he said.
"But you are afraid of something. I see it in your eyes." He took a step closer, his presence filling the space between them. She could smell the scent of him, a mixture of leather, wood smoke, and something else, something wild and untamed. It was a scent that both repelled and intrigued her. "What is it you fear, Emmeline?" he asked, his voice softening, losing some of its harsh edge.
"Tell me."
She hesitated, torn between her pride and a sudden, overwhelming urge to confide in him, to share the burden of her fears, her sorrows. But she resisted. She would not give him that power over her. "I fear nothing," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He reached out, his fingers brushing against her cheek, a touch so light, so unexpected, that it sent a jolt of electricity through her. She flinched, but did not pull away. "We all have our fears, Emmeline," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Even the Warwick wolf." He let his fingers linger for another beat before he finally dropped his hand. He turned and gestured to the clothes laid out upon a stool, fine and clearly meant for her.
"Get some rest.
We will speak more on the morrow." The words were a command, but the tone was softer than before. The night had cracked his steely facade, if only a bit. Chapter 4. Whispers in the Stone Halls. The first few weeks at Castle Draken were a blur of unfamiliar routines and strained interactions. Emmeline found herself navigating a complex web of courtly etiquette and unspoken rivalries, all while trying to maintain a semblance of dignity and control in the face of her forced marriage. The castle itself felt like a living entity, its stone walls whispering secrets she couldn't quite decipher, its long corridors echoing with the ghosts of generations past. She spent her days exploring the castle and its grounds, familiarizing herself with its layout and its inhabitants. She visited the library, a vast, dusty chamber filled with ancient tomes and scrolls, where she sought solace in the company of books. She walked in the gardens, a walled oasis of tranquility amidst the stark, imposing architecture of the castle, where she found a measure of peace in the scent of herbs and the gentle murmur of the fountain. She also made an effort to connect with the people of Draken, the servants, the guards, the women who worked in the kitchens and the stables. She learned their names, listened to their stories, and offered them small kindnesses, a smile, a word of encouragement. She wanted them to see her not as a conquering enemy, but as a woman of compassion and understanding. Agnes, her faithful nurse, remained her constant companion, a source of comfort and strength in this unfamiliar and often hostile environment. Agnes was a shrewd observer, her eyes and ears always open, and she provided Emmeline with valuable insights into the workings of the Warwick household, the relationships between its members, the hidden tensions that simmered beneath the surface. "Lady Isolde is the one to watch, my lady," Agnes warned her one evening, as they sat together in Emmeline's chamber, the fire casting flickering shadows on the walls. "She has the ear of Lord Nicholas, and she is not to be trusted." Emmeline nodded, remembering the unsettling conversation she had had with Isolde during the wedding feast. "She seems ambitious," she said. "Ambitious and cunning," Agnes corrected. "She was deeply attached to her brother, Nicholas' father, and she resents any perceived threat to the Warwick power. She sees you as an outsider, a potential rival." Emmeline sighed. She had known this would not be easy. She was surrounded by enemies, both open and hidden, and she had to be constantly vigilant. Her interactions with Nicholas remained formal and distant. They shared meals together, attended courtly functions, and occasionally exchanged polite conversation, but there was always a wall between them, a barrier of mistrust and resentment that seemed insurmountable. He treated her with a cool courtesy, a detached politeness that was more infuriating than outright hostility. She observed him carefully, trying to understand the man behind the mask of power. He was a complex character, a mixture of strength and vulnerability, ruthlessness and compassion. He was a skilled warrior, a respected leader, but he also possessed a keen intellect and a surprising sensitivity to the needs of his people. She saw him interact with his men, his voice firm but fair, his judgments swift and decisive. She saw him comfort a grieving widow, his hand resting gently on her shoulder, his words offering solace and support. She saw him play with the children of the castle, his face breaking into a rare, genuine smile, his laughter echoing through the courtyard. These glimpses of his humanity both intrigued and confused her. How could the man who had burned her family's lands, who had forced her into this marriage, also possess such kindness, such empathy? It was a paradox she couldn't quite reconcile. One evening, as they sat together in the great hall after supper, Nicholas turned to her, his gray eyes unusually soft. "You seem restless, Emmeline," he said. "Is something troubling you?" She hesitated, surprised by his unexpected concern. "I am adjusting," she said, choosing her words carefully. "It is a different life here at Draken." He nodded, his gaze searching hers. "I know it is not what you wanted," he said. "This marriage, it was not your choice." She met his gaze unflinchingly. "No," she said. "It was not." He sighed, a hint of weariness in his voice. "I did what I thought was best," he said. "For my people, for my lands, to end the war." "At what cost?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He looked away, his jaw tightening. "There is always a cost," he said. "In war, in peace, in everything." A silence fell between them, heavy and fraught with unspoken emotions. Emmeline felt a strange stirring within her, a flicker of empathy for this man, this enemy, who seemed to carry his own burdens, his own sorrows. Suddenly, a commotion erupted at the far end of the hall. A messenger, breathless and disheveled, burst through the doors, his face pale with alarm. He rushed towards Nicholas, bowing low. "My lord," he gasped. "Riders approach. They bear the colors of Lord Kenrick." Nicholas's expression hardened, his eyes turning to steel. Lord Kenrick was a neighboring lord, a long-standing rival of the Warwicks, and a man known for his treachery and ambition. How many? Nicholas demanded, his voice sharp and commanding. At least 50, my lord, the messenger replied. Heavily armed. Nicholas rose from his chair, his hand instinctively reaching for the sword that hung at his side. Prepare the defenses, he ordered. Every man to his post. The hall erupted in a flurry of activity as soldiers rushed to arm themselves and take up their positions. Emmeline watched, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and a strange, unexpected excitement. The whispers of the stone halls had suddenly become a roar. This was not just a castle, it was a fortress, and it was about to be tested. The arrival of Lord Kenrick would clearly change more than a day. It would change everything. Chapter 5. The Falcon and the Dove. The news of Lord Kenrick's approach sent a wave of apprehension through Castle Draken. Preparations for defense were swift and efficient, the well-oiled machinery of a fortress accustomed to conflict. Men at arms, clad in leather and chainmail, took up positions along the battlements, their faces grim and resolute. Archers positioned themselves in the towers, their arrows nocked and ready. The courtyard, once a bustling hub of activity, became a scene of organized chaos as supplies were moved, horses readied, and orders barked. Emmeline, despite her initial fear, found herself caught up in the urgency of the situation. She refused to be confined to her chambers, instead insisting on assisting where she could. She helped the women of the castle prepare bandages and salves, her hands steady and her movements precise, drawing on the knowledge she had gained during the siege of Briarhall. She also sought out Agnes, her nurse, and entrusted her with a crucial task. Find out everything you can about Lord Kenrick, she instructed. His strengths, his weaknesses, his alliances. Any information could be vital. Agnes nodded, her eyes gleaming with a mixture of concern and determination. I will, my lady, she promised. Leave it to me. As the hours passed, the tension within the castle walls grew thicker, palpable. Emmeline paced the battlements, her gaze fixed on the horizon, searching for any sign of the approaching enemy. The wind whipped around her, carrying the scent of rain and the distant rumble of thunder, mirroring the storm brewing within her own heart. She found Nicholas standing near the main gate, his face etched with a mixture of determination and concern. He was conferring with his captain of the guard, a grizzled veteran named Sir Gareth, their voices low and urgent. Emmeline approached them, her steps hesitant. Nicholas turned, his gray eyes meeting hers, and for a moment, the wall between them seemed to crumble. He looked tired, the lines around his eyes more pronounced, but there was also a flicker of something else in his gaze, a vulnerability that she had not seen before. Is there any news? She asked, her voice barely a whisper above the wind. He shook his head.
Not yet, he said.
But they will be here soon. A silence fell between them, heavy with unspoken emotions. Emmeline felt a strange urge to reach out to him, to offer him some comfort, some reassurance. But she resisted. He was still her enemy, the man who had brought her to this place against her will. They say Kenrick is a cruel man, she said, breaking the silence. Ruthless and ambitious. Nicholas nodded, his jaw tightening. He is, he said. He has long coveted the Warwick lands, and he will stop at nothing to get them. What will you do? She asked, her voice filled with a mixture of apprehension and a strange, unexpected concern for his safety. He met her gaze, his eyes intense and unreadable. I will defend what is mine, he said. My people, my lands, my wife. His words, the unexpected inclusion of her in his declaration, sent a shiver down her spine. It was the first time he had acknowledged her as his wife in anything other than a formal, obligatory way. Suddenly, a shout went up from one of the watchtowers. Riders approaching. Nicholas turned, his gaze sweeping the horizon. In the distance, a cloud of dust rose from the road, growing larger with each passing moment. The enemy had arrived. He turned back to Emmeline, his expression hardening. Go to the chapel, he ordered. Stay there until I send for you. It is the safest place in the castle. She hesitated, torn between her desire to obey him and a fierce urge to stand by his side, to face this threat together. But she began. He cut her off, his voice firm but gentle. "No buts, Emmeline," he said.
Go. Now.
She met his gaze one last time, a silent exchange of understanding, of shared fear and determination, and then she turned and fled, her heart pounding in her chest. The chapel was a small, stone sanctuary, nestled deep within the heart of the castle. The air was cool and still, the silence broken only by the faint murmur of prayers from the handful of women and children who had sought refuge there. Emmeline knelt before the altar, her hands clasped tightly together, her thoughts a chaotic jumble of fear, anxiety, and a strange, unexpected hope. She prayed for the safety of the castle, for the lives of the men who were defending it, and, to her surprise, she found herself praying for Nicholas as well. She prayed that he would be strong, that he would be wise, that he would survive this battle. As the hours passed, the sounds of conflict grew louder, echoing through the stone walls of the chapel. The clash of steel, the shouts of men, the screams of the wounded, all painted a vivid picture of the battle raging outside. Emmeline closed her eyes, trying to block out the sounds, but they penetrated her very soul, filling her with a sense of dread and helplessness. She thought of Nicholas, out there in the thick of the fighting, his life on the line. She imagined him, his face grim and determined, his sword flashing in the sunlight, his voice ringing out above the din of battle. She saw him as both a warrior and a protector, a man fighting for his home, his people, his wife. The image surprised her, the sudden realization of the bond that had formed between them, despite their forced union, despite their animosity. They were bound together by fate, by duty, and now, by a shared threat. Suddenly, the door of the chapel burst open, and Agnes rushed inside, her face pale and streaked with tears. "My lady," she gasped, "the battle, it is not going well. Lord Kenric, he has breached the outer walls." Emmeline's heart sank. The news was dire, the worst possible scenario. If Kenric's forces broke through the inner defenses, the castle would fall, and everyone within would be at his mercy. She looked at Agnes and felt the woman trembling. "We must have faith," Emmeline said, in a strong voice she could barely recognize as her own. But even as she said the words, the sounds of the battle grew closer, more ferocious. The hope was fraying. The dove was in the falcon's grasp. Chapter 6. Scars of the Past. The news of Kenric's breach of the outer walls sent a wave of panic through the chapel. Women wept, children cried, and even the stoic faces of the few remaining guards showed signs of fear. Emmeline, despite her own terror, forced herself to remain calm, to project an aura of strength and reassurance. She knew that if she faltered, if she showed any sign of weakness, the fragile hope that remained would be shattered. She moved among the terrified inhabitants of the chapel, offering words of comfort, holding trembling hands, soothing crying children. She spoke of courage, of faith, of the strength of the warrior spirit. She reminded them of the tales of their ancestors, of the battles they had fought and won, of the resilience they had shown in the face of adversity. Her words, though born of desperation, seemed to have a calming effect. The weeping subsided, the cries quieted, and a sense of fragile hope began to flicker in the dimly lit chapel. Emmeline found a strange strength within herself, a reservoir of courage she had not known she possessed. She was a lady of Briarhall, and she would not surrender to fear. As the sounds of battle grew closer, drawing ever nearer to the heart of the castle, Emmeline made a decision. She could not remain idle, waiting for fate to decide her destiny. She had to do something, anything to help. She sought out Agnes, her nurse, who had been frantically searching through a chest of old linens, her face etched with worry. "Agnes," Emmeline said, her voice firm and resolute. "I need your help." Agnes looked up, her eyes wide with surprise. "My lady, what is it?" "I am going to the Great Hall," Emmeline declared. "I may be able to offer some assistance to the wounded." Agnes gasped. "My lady, it is too dangerous. Lord Nicholas forbade it." "I know," Emmeline said. But I cannot stand idly by while our people are fighting and dying. I have some knowledge of healing, and I may be of use." Agnes hesitated, torn between her loyalty to Nicholas and her concern for Emmeline's safety. But she saw the determination in Emmeline's eyes, the unwavering resolve that mirrored her own. "Very well, my lady," Agnes said, her voice trembling slightly. "But I am coming with you." Together, they left the relative safety of the chapel and ventured into the heart of the besieged castle. The corridors were filled with smoke and the acrid smell of burning wood. The sounds of battle were deafening, the clash of steel, the shouts of men, the screams of the wounded, all echoing through the stone passageways. They made their way to the great hall, which had been transformed into a makeshift infirmary. The scene that greeted them was one of chaos and carnage. Wounded men lay sprawled on the floor, their bodies covered in blood and grime. The castle's physician, Master Alaric, and his assistants were frantically working to tend to the injured, their faces pale and strained. Emmeline did not hesitate. She knelt beside the nearest wounded man, a young soldier with a gaping wound in his leg, and began to assess his injuries. She tore strips of linen from the chest Agnes had brought and began to clean and bind the wound, her hands moving with a practiced efficiency that surprised even herself. She worked tirelessly for hours, moving from one wounded man to the next, offering comfort, tending to their injuries, her own fear forgotten in the urgency of the moment. She saw the gratitude in their eyes, the flicker of hope that her presence inspired, and it gave her strength to carry on. As she worked, she caught glimpses of the battle raging outside. Through the tall, arched windows of the great hall, she saw the flash of steel, the flames leaping from burning buildings, the figures of men locked in mortal combat. She saw the Warwick banner, the snarling wolf's head, still flying defiantly above the castle walls, a symbol of their unwavering resistance. At one point, she saw Nicholas, his face covered in blood and grime, his armor dented and scarred, fighting with the ferocity of a cornered wolf. He was surrounded by Kenric's men, but he held his ground, his sword a blur of motion, cutting down his enemies with ruthless efficiency. Emmeline's heart ached with a mixture of fear and admiration. She had never seen such raw courage, such unwavering determination. He was fighting for his home, his people, his wife. And in that moment, she realized that she was no longer just an observer, a pawn in a game of power. She was a part of this, a part of the Warwick defense, a part of Nicholas's life. Suddenly, a cry of alarm went up. "They've broken through. Kenric's men are in the hall." Emmeline looked up, her heart pounding with terror. A group of Kenric's soldiers had burst through the main doors of the great hall, their swords dripping with blood, their faces contorted with rage. They charged towards the wounded, their intent clear, to slaughter the defenseless. Emmeline stood, her body trembling, but her spirit resolute. She would not let them harm her people. She grabbed a discarded sword from the floor, its weight unfamiliar in her hand, but its purpose clear. She would fight. Just as the first soldier reached her, a figure emerged from the chaos, a whirlwind of steel and fury. It was Nicholas. He had somehow fought his way back to the great hall, his face a mask of rage, his sword dripping with the blood of his enemies. He engaged the intruders with a ferocity that stunned even Emmeline. He moved like a man possessed, his every blow precise and deadly. He cut down one soldier, then another, his movements fluid and graceful, like those of a dancer of death. The remaining soldiers, seeing their comrades fall, hesitated, their courage faltering in the face of such overwhelming force. Nicholas pressed his advantage, driving them back towards the doors, his voice ringing out above the din of battle.
"Get out!" he roared.
"This is Warwick land. You will not defile it." The soldiers, their spirit broken, retreated, fleeing back into the chaos of the battle. Nicholas stood, his chest heaving, his sword dripping with blood, his gaze fixed on Emmeline. He slowly walked to her, his eyes locking on hers, that were wide with shock and, he realized, a touch of admiration. He reached a hand out to her face, covered in sweat and blood that wasn't hers. "Are you hurt?" he asked. The question, raw and direct, was unlike anything she had expected. The scars of the past, it seemed, were starting to fade. But a new scar, one of unity, was beginning to form. The question hung, raw and full of uncharacteristic fear, in the smoke-filled air. Chapter 7. The Huntress and the Prey. Emmeline stared at Nicholas, her breath caught in her throat. His face, streaked with blood and grime, was closer than it had ever been, his gray eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her heart pound. The raw concern in his voice, the unexpected tenderness of his touch, sent a wave of unfamiliar emotions washing over her. I am unharmed," she stammered, her voice trembling slightly. She lowered the sword she still held, the weight of it suddenly feeling heavy and awkward in her hand. He reached out, his fingers gently brushing against her cheek, wiping away a smudge of soot. His touch, though fleeting, sent a shiver down her spine, a sensation both terrifying and strangely exhilarating. "You are brave," he said, his voice a low murmur, his gaze lingering on hers. "Foolish, but brave." She met his gaze unflinchingly, a flicker of defiance in her eyes. "I could not stand idly by," she said, "while my people were in danger." He nodded, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. "I see that," he said. "The Lady of Briarhall is not one to hide in the shadows." A silence fell between them, filled only by the crackling of the fire and the distant sounds of the ongoing battle. Emmeline felt a strange connection to him in that moment, a bond forged in the crucible of danger, of shared fear and determination. He lowered his hand, his gaze shifting away from hers, and the spell was broken. The reality of their situation, of their forced marriage, of the animosity that still simmered beneath the surface, came crashing back down. "We must see to the wounded," he said, his voice turning brisk and businesslike. "The battle is not yet won." Emmeline nodded, her own emotions retreating behind a wall of carefully constructed composure. She followed him back into the chaos of the great hall, where they worked side by side, tending to the injured, offering comfort and support. Despite the ongoing danger, a sense of camaraderie had developed among the inhabitants of the castle. The Warwick soldiers, who had initially viewed Emmeline with suspicion and distrust, now looked upon her with a newfound respect, even admiration. They had seen her courage, her compassion, her willingness to fight alongside them, and it had earned her their loyalty. As the day wore on, the tide of the battle began to turn. The Warwick forces, bolstered by Nicholas's fierce leadership and the unexpected resilience of their defense, slowly pushed back Kenrick's men. The fighting was brutal and relentless, but the Warwick spirit remained unbroken. Emmeline continued to work tirelessly, her hands stained with blood, her body aching with fatigue, but her determination unwavering. She had found a purpose in this chaos, a sense of belonging that she had not expected. She was no longer just a prisoner of war, a pawn in a game of power. She was a part of this, a part of the Warwick defense, a part of Nicholas's world. Late in the afternoon, a shout went up from the battlements. "Kenrick is retreating. He is fleeing the field." A wave of relief washed over the exhausted defenders of Castle Draken. The battle was over. They had won. Nicholas, his face covered in sweat and blood, his armor battered and torn, returned to the great hall, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and triumph. He looked around at the wounded, at the exhausted faces of his people, and a slow smile spread across his lips. "We have held," he said, his voice hoarse but strong.
Draken stands.
"Kenrick is defeated." A cheer went up from the assembled crowd, a ragged, heartfelt expression of relief and gratitude. Emmeline met Nicholas's gaze across the room, and for a moment, their eyes locked. She saw a flicker of something in his gaze, a hint of admiration, of respect, perhaps even affection. He approached her, his steps slow and deliberate. He stopped before her, his presence filling her vision. "Thank you, Emmeline," he said, his voice low and intimate. "For your courage, for your compassion, for standing by my side." She met his gaze, her own emotions a swirling mix of confusion and estrangement, unsettling attraction. "I did what I had to do," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. His touch sent a jolt of electricity through her, a sensation that both frightened and excited her. "You are more than you seem, Lady of Briarhall," he said, his voice a husky murmur. "Much more." He leaned in, his lips brushing against her ear, his breath warm against her skin. "The dove," he whispered, "has become a falcon." He pulled back, his gaze lingering on hers for a moment longer, and then he turned and walked away, leaving Emmeline standing there, her heart pounding, her mind reeling. The hunt, it seemed, had just begun, and she was no longer sure who was the hunter and who was the prey. She felt a tug at her skirt. It was Agnes, her eyes filled with a knowing that made Emmeline blush. Chapter 8. A Glimmer of Truce. The days following the battle were a period of recovery and reflection. Castle Draken, though scarred, had weathered the storm. The wounded were tended, the dead mourned, and the slow process of rebuilding began. Emmeline found herself increasingly drawn into the life of the castle, her initial apprehension gradually giving way to a sense of purpose and belonging. The victory over Kenrick had shifted the dynamics within Draken. The Warwick soldiers, who had once regarded Emmeline with suspicion, now treated her with respect and a grudging admiration. They had seen her bravery firsthand, her willingness to stand alongside them in the face of danger, and it had earned her their loyalty. Even the castle staff, initially wary of the Briarhall bride, began to warm to her, drawn in by her genuine kindness and her efforts to understand their lives. Nicholas, too, seemed different. The wall of formality and distance that had separated them began to crumble, replaced by a tentative truce, a cautious exploration of common ground. He sought her out more often, engaging her in conversation, sharing his thoughts and concerns about the running of the castle and the ongoing threat from rival lords. He even began to include her in his counsels, seeking her opinion on matters of strategy and diplomacy. Emmeline, drawing on her own upbringing and her knowledge of courtly intrigue, offered insightful observations and surprisingly shrewd advice. She discovered a talent for negotiation, a knack for finding common ground and resolving disputes that surprised even herself. One evening, as they sat together in the great hall after supper, Nicholas turned to her, his gray eyes unusually soft. "You have a gift, Emmeline," he said. "A way of seeing things that others do not." Emmeline blushed, surprised by his compliment. "I simply try to understand people," she said. "To find a way to bridge the differences between them." He nodded, his gaze searching hers.
"It is a rare gift," he said.
"And one that is sorely needed in these troubled times." A silence fell between them, filled only by the crackling of the fire and the distant murmur of voices. Emmeline felt a strange sense of intimacy with him in that moment, a connection that transcended their forced marriage, their initial animosity. "I have been thinking," Nicholas said, breaking the silence, "about Briarhall, about your people." Emmeline's heart quickened. This was a topic they had avoided, a source of tension that still simmered beneath the surface. "What about them?" she asked, her voice cautious. "They have suffered much," he said. "Because of the war, because of me." She met his gaze unflinchingly. "They have," she agreed. He sighed, a hint of regret in his voice. "I would like to make amends," he said. "To offer some assistance in rebuilding your lands, your villages." Emmeline was stunned. This was an unexpected gesture, a sign of genuine remorse that she had not anticipated.
"Why?"
she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He looked away, his jaw tightening. "Because it is the right thing to do," he said. "And because you are my wife. Your people are now my responsibility as well." His words, the unexpected admission of her place in his life, sent a wave of warmth through her. It was the first time he had acknowledged their marriage as anything other than a political arrangement, a means to an end. "Thank you, Nicholas," she said, her voice filled with a sincerity that surprised even herself. That means a great deal to me." He met her gaze again, and for a moment, their eyes locked. She saw a flicker of something in his gaze, a hint of vulnerability, of longing, that mirrored her own conflicted emotions. He reached out, his hand gently covering hers, his touch sending a shiver down her spine. "We have a long way to go, Emmeline," he said, his voice a low murmur. "But perhaps we can find a way to build something new. Together." His words hung in the air, a fragile promise of a future that seemed both impossible and tantalizingly within reach. Emmeline felt a stirring within her, a flicker of hope that she had thought long extinguished. As the days turned into weeks, the tentative truce between them blossomed into something more. They spent hours together, exploring the castle and its surrounding lands, sharing stories of their childhoods, their hopes, their fears. They discovered a shared love of falconry, spending mornings on the windswept moors, watching their birds soar through the sky. They debated philosophy and poetry in the library, their minds engaging in a lively dance of ideas. They laughed, something she hadn't expected in the den of the wolf. Emmeline found herself drawn to Nicholas's strength, his intelligence, his unexpected kindness. She saw beneath the surface of the warrior, the lord, to the man within, a man haunted by the past, burdened by responsibility, but also capable of great compassion and a deep longing for connection. And yet, a shadow of doubt remained. She could not forget the past, the destruction he had wrought upon her family's lands, the pain he had caused. She could not fully trust him, not yet. The scars of the past were still too raw, the wounds too deep. One evening, as they stood together on the battlements, watching the sun set over the distant hills, Emmeline turned to Nicholas, her expression troubled. "Can we ever truly overcome what happened?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "The war, the pain, the hatred?" He looked at her, his gray eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and understanding. "I do not know, Emmeline," he said, "but I am willing to try. Are you?" His words, honest and challenging, mirrored the complex truth of their situation. They had made progress and started to build a bridge. But the chasm was deep, and the bridge was not yet made of stone, only a glimmer of hope. Chapter 9. The Serpent in the Garden. Despite the growing closeness between Emmeline and Nicholas, a sense of unease lingered in the air at Castle Draken. Whispers circulated among the servants, subtle glances were exchanged among the courtiers, and Emmeline sensed a hidden tension, a secret she couldn't quite grasp. Agnes, her ever-watchful nurse, confirmed her suspicions. "There is talk, my lady," Agnes said one evening, as they sat together in Emmeline's chamber. "Talk of discontent, of divided loyalties." "Discontent? Among whom?" Emmeline asked, her brow furrowed with concern. "Some of the older retainers," Agnes replied. "Those who are loyal to Nicholas's father, the old Lord Warwick. They do not fully accept you. They see you as an outsider, a threat to the old ways." Emmeline sighed. She had known this would not be easy. Winning the trust of the Warwick people was a slow, arduous process, and she had anticipated resistance from some quarters. "And what of Lady Isolde?" Emmeline asked, remembering the unsettling conversation she had had with Nicholas's aunt during the wedding feast. Agnes's expression turned grave. "She is the center of it, my lady," she said. "She fuels the discontent, whispers poison in the ears of those who will listen. She does not wish to see you succeed." Emmeline felt a chill run down her spine. She had sensed Isolde's animosity from the beginning, but she had not realized the extent of her influence, the danger she posed. "We must be careful, Agnes," Emmeline said. "We must be vigilant." Agnes nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of concern and determination. "I will watch and listen, my lady," she promised. "And I will warn you of any danger." Emmeline's suspicions were further heightened by a series of unsettling incidents. Small things at first seemingly insignificant. A misplaced document, a spilled goblet of wine, a whispered conversation that abruptly ceased when she approached. But taken together, they painted a picture of deliberate sabotage, of someone working to undermine her position, to sow discord between her and Nicholas. One evening, a more serious incident occurred. Emmeline was returning to her chamber after a late supper in the great hall when she was accosted in a dimly lit corridor. A figure, cloaked and hooded, stepped out of the shadows, blocking her path. "You do not belong here, Lady of Briarhall," the figure hissed, their voice disguised and menacing. "Go back to your own lands, before it is too late." Emmeline stood her ground, her heart pounding in her chest, but her voice steady.
"Who are you?"
she demanded. "Show yourself." The figure hesitated, then, with a swift movement, lunged at her, shoving her against the stone wall. Emmeline cried out, her head striking the hard surface, and she slumped to the floor, dazed and disoriented. The figure fled, disappearing into the shadows, leaving Emmeline alone and shaken. She struggled to her feet, her head throbbing, her body trembling. She made her way back to her chamber, where she found Agnes waiting anxiously. Agnes gasped when she saw Emmeline's condition, her face paling with alarm. "My lady, what happened?" Emmeline recounted the incident, her voice trembling slightly. Agnes examined her head, finding a small bruise, but no serious injury. "This is Isolde's work, my lady," Agnes said, her voice filled with anger and concern. "I am sure of it. She is growing bolder, more desperate." Emmeline nodded, her own suspicions confirmed. She knew she had to act, to confront Isolde, to expose her treachery. But she also knew she needed proof, evidence that would convince Nicholas of his aunt's betrayal. The following day, Emmeline sought out Nicholas, her mind racing with plans. She found him in the library, poring over a stack of documents, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Nicholas," she said, her voice firm and resolute. "We need to talk." He looked up, his gray eyes meeting hers, and he sensed the seriousness of her tone. "What is it, Emmeline?" he asked. She told him about the incident in the corridor, about her suspicions regarding Isolde, about the whispers of discontent among the older retainers. He listened patiently, his expression growing increasingly grave. "I cannot believe it," he said, when she had finished. "Isolde, she would, Emmeline insisted. And she has. I have no proof, I know, but I feel it in my bones. She is a danger to us both, Nicholas. To your rule, to our marriage." He sighed, running a hand through his hair, his face etched with conflict. He was torn between his loyalty to his aunt, a woman who had been a mother figure to him, and the growing trust he had placed in Emmeline. "What would you have me do?" he asked, his voice filled with uncertainty. "We must set a trap," Emmeline said. "A way to expose her treachery, to reveal her true intentions." Nicholas hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Very well," he said.
"Tell me your plan."
Emmeline outlined her idea. It was risky, even dangerous, but it was their best chance to unveil the serpent that had coiled in their home's heart. Nicholas studied her as she finished, and he seemed to see her, truly see her, for the first time. His wife. Chapter 10. Threads of Deceit. Emmeline's plan was intricate, relying on misdirection and careful manipulation of Isolde's own ambitions. It centered around a fabricated letter, purportedly from Lord Kenrick, expressing a renewed interest and alliance with the Warwicks, but only if Nicholas were to set aside his Briarhall bride and take a wife more amenable to Kenrick's interests. The letter was a carefully crafted forgery, penned by Emmeline herself, with Agnes's assistance in mimicking Kenrick's distinctive script and seal. It was designed to play on Isolde's known hatred of Emmeline and her desire to maintain the Warwick power through a more advantageous alliance. The plan was to accidentally leave the letter where Isolde would be sure to find it, and then observe her reaction, hoping she would betray her true intentions by attempting to act on the information it contained. Nicholas, though initially hesitant, agreed to cooperate. He was still reluctant to believe his aunt capable of outright treachery, but Emmeline's conviction and the mounting evidence of sabotage had swayed him. He recognized the potential danger Isolde posed, not just to Emmeline, but to the stability of his own rule. The accident was staged in the library, a place Isolde frequented. Emmeline, under the pretense of researching ancient treaties, carelessly left the forged letter among a stack of documents on a table, ensuring it was partially visible, its seal tantalizingly exposed. She and Nicholas then concealed themselves in a small alcove, hidden behind a tapestry where they could observe Isolde's actions without being seen. Agnes, stationed outside the library, was tasked with alerting them to Isolde's approach. The wait was agonizing. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, the silence broken only by the occasional rustling of pages and the frantic beating of Emmeline's heart. She felt a mixture of apprehension and anticipation, her nerves on edge. Finally, Agnes gave the signal, a discreet cough from outside the door. Emmeline and Nicholas held their breath, their eyes fixed on the entrance to the library. Isolde entered, her tall, elegant figure gliding across the room with her usual air of self-assurance. She paused, her gaze sweeping the library. Then, as if drawn by an invisible force, she moved towards the table where the letter lay. She spotted it, her eyes widening slightly, her hand reaching out to touch the seal, as if to confirm its authenticity. She hesitated, glancing around the room to ensure she was alone. Then, with a swift movement, she snatched the letter and concealed it within the folds of her gown. Emmeline and Nicholas exchanged a look, their suspicions confirmed. Isolde had taken the bait. Isolde did not leave the library immediately. She lingered, pretending to browse the shelves, but her movements were agitated, her eyes darting nervously around the room. It was clear she was struggling to contain her excitement, her eagerness to act on the information she had just acquired. Finally, she left the library, her pace quickening as she moved down the corridor. Emmeline and Nicholas emerged from their hiding place, their faces grim. "She took it," Emmeline said, her voice a mixture of triumph and relief. "She took the letter." Nicholas nodded, his jaw tight.
"So it seems," he said.
"My aunt a traitor." The pain in his voice was evident, the betrayal cutting deep. Emmeline felt a pang of sympathy for him, despite her own sense of vindication.
"What now?"
Nicholas asked, his voice filled with uncertainty. "Now," Emmeline said, "we wait, we watch, and we see what she does with it." They did not have to wait long. The following day, Isolde sought out Nicholas, her manner unusually solicitous, her tone carefully veiled. "My dear nephew," she said, "I have heard rumors. Rumors of a renewed interest from Lord Kenrick in an alliance with the Warwicks."
Nicolas feignait de surprise.
"Kenrick?"
he said.
"After his defeat? I find that hard to believe." Isolde smiled, a knowing smile that sent a shiver down Emmeline's spine.
"It is true, Nicholas," she said.
"But there are conditions. Conditions that may be difficult to accept." "And what are these conditions?" Nicholas asked, his voice carefully neutral. Isolde hesitated. Then, with a dramatic flourish, she produced the forged letter from her gown. "This," she said, "explains it all." Nicholas took the letter, pretending to read it for the first time, his expression carefully controlled. Emmeline, watching from a discreet distance, held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. "I see," Nicholas said, his voice heavy with feigned disappointment. "Kenrick demands a change of wife." Isolde nodded, her eyes gleaming with triumph. "It is a regrettable condition," she said. "But for the good of the Warwicks, for the security of your lands, it may be necessary." Nicholas looked at Isolde, his gaze hardening. "You suggest," he said, his voice dangerously low, "that I should set aside my wife? Betray my vows?" Isolde met his gaze unflinchingly. "For the greater good, Nicholas," she said. "It is a sacrifice that must be made." Nicholas rose from his chair, his face a mask of fury. "You are a traitor, Isolde," he said, his voice ringing out through the room. "You have betrayed my trust, betrayed your family, betrayed everything we stand for." Isolde paled, her composure finally cracking. "Nicholas I only meant you meant to usurp my power," Nicholas said, his voice filled with scorn. "To manipulate me, to control me. You have failed." The threads of deceit, so carefully woven, were now unraveling. And they pointed at only one weaver, and that was Isolde. The exposure was complete, but the fallout was just beginning. Chapter 11. The Price of Honor. The revelation of Isolde's treachery sent shockwaves through Castle Draken. The woman who had been a pillar of the Warwick household, a trusted advisor and confidant, was now exposed as a manipulative schemer, driven by her own ambition and resentment. Nicholas, though deeply wounded by his aunt's betrayal, acted swiftly and decisively. He ordered Isolde confined to her chambers, pending a full investigation into her actions. He summoned his council, the senior members of the Warwick household, and laid out the evidence against her, the forged letter, Emmeline's testimony, and Isolde's own damning words. The council, initially stunned by the accusations, quickly came to accept the truth. Isolde's long-standing animosity towards Emmeline, her subtle attempts to undermine her position, and her known ambition for power, all pointed to her guilt. The punishment for treason was severe, traditionally death. But Nicholas, despite his anger and sense of betrayal, hesitated to condemn his own aunt to such a fate. He was torn between his duty to uphold the law and his lingering affection for the woman who had been a mother figure to him. Emmeline, witnessing his internal struggle, felt a pang of sympathy for him. She knew the pain of family betrayal, the conflicting emotions of love and anger, loyalty and disappointment. She sought him out in his private chamber, finding him staring out the window, his face etched with sorrow. He turned as she entered, his gray eyes filled with a mixture of pain and uncertainty. "What am I to do, Emmeline?" he asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. "She is my aunt, my mother's sister. I cannot simply execute her." Emmeline approached him, her hand reaching out to touch his arm, a gesture of comfort and support. "I know it is difficult, Nicholas," she said, "but you must do what is right. For your people, for your lands, for yourself." He looked at her, his gaze searching hers. "But what is right?" he asked. "Justice demands one thing, but my heart it cries out for another." "There are different forms of justice, Nicholas," Emmeline said. "There is the justice of the law, and there is the justice of the heart. Sometimes they are not the same." She paused, considering her words carefully.
"Perhaps there is another way," she said.
"A way to punish her treachery, but also to show mercy." Nicholas looked at her, his interest piqued. "What do you suggest?" Emmeline outlined her proposal. Instead of death, Isolde could be banished from Castle Draken, stripped of her titles and possessions, and sent to live out her days in a remote convent, a place of quiet contemplation and repentance. It was a harsh punishment, a life of exile and isolation, but it was also a merciful one, sparing Isolde's life and offering her a chance for redemption. Nicholas listened intently, his expression thoughtful. He recognized the wisdom in Emmeline's suggestion, the balance between justice and compassion. "It is a fitting punishment," he said, his voice slowly regaining its strength. "It is just, but it is also merciful." He turned to her, his gaze softening. "Thank you, Emmeline," he said. "You have a way of seeing things, of finding a path through the darkness." Emmeline met his gaze, a warmth spreading through her. "We are in this together, Nicholas," she said. "We will find our way together." The following day, Nicholas announced his decision to the council. Isolde would be banished from Draken, her titles and possessions forfeit, her life spared but forever altered. The council, though initially surprised by the leniency of the punishment, ultimately accepted Nicholas's judgment. They recognized the wisdom in his decision, the need to temper justice with mercy, to heal the wounds of betrayal rather than exacerbate them. Isolde, when informed of her fate, reacted with a mixture of anger and defiance. She railed against Nicholas, accusing him of being manipulated by Emmeline, of betraying his own family. But her words fell on deaf ears. Her treachery had been exposed, her power broken, and her fate sealed. As Isolde was escorted from the castle, her head held high, her expression defiant, she paused before Emmeline, her eyes filled with a venomous hatred. "You may have won this battle, Lady of Briarhall," she hissed. "But the war is far from over. You will never truly belong here. You will never be one of us." Emmeline met her gaze unflinchingly, her voice steady and calm. "I am where I belong, Isolde," she said. "And I will not be intimidated by your threats." Isolde turned and walked away, her figure disappearing into the distance, leaving Emmeline standing there, feeling a mixture of relief and a lingering sense of unease. Isolde's words, though spiteful, had struck a chord. The price of honor, Emmeline knew, was often steep. And she also had at least one small idea that Isolde was not entirely wrong. The war had many battles. This was just one. Chapter 12. Echoes of Betrayal. Isolde's banishment, though a necessary step, left a void in Castle Draken. The air of suspicion and unease lingered, and the echoes of her betrayal reverberated through the halls. Nicholas, burdened by the weight of his decision, withdrew into himself, his usual confidence shaken, his spirit wounded. Emmeline, despite her own relief at Isolde's removal, felt a pang of sympathy for Nicholas. She understood the pain of family betrayal, the conflicting emotions of love and anger, loyalty and disappointment. She tried to reach out to him, to offer comfort and support, but he remained distant, his walls rebuilt, his heart guarded. She found him one evening in the library, staring into the fire, his face etched with sorrow. She approached him silently, her hand reaching out to touch his arm, a gesture of empathy. "Nicholas," she said softly, "are you all right?" He turned, his gray eyes filled with a mixture of pain and weariness. "I do not know, Emmeline," he said. "I feel lost."
Betrayed.
"I understand," she said. "It is a difficult thing, to be betrayed by someone you trust." He looked at her, his gaze searching hers. Have you ever felt this way?" he asked. "Betrayed by someone you loved?" Emmeline hesitated, her own past pain rising to the surface. She had never spoken to Nicholas about her previous betrothal, about the man she had been promised before the war, before her forced marriage to him. "Yes," she said, her voice barely a whisper.
"I have."
Nicholas's interest piqued.
"Tell me," he said. "Tell me about it."
Emmeline hesitated again, then, with a deep breath, she began to speak. She told him about Lord Rowan, a neighboring lord to whom she had been betrothed since childhood. He had been a kind and gentle man, and she had grown to care for him deeply. But when the war broke out, Rowan had sided with the king, against her brother, against her family. He had fought against Briarhall, and he had been killed in battle, leaving Emmeline heartbroken and filled with a sense of betrayal. "I loved him," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "But he chose his loyalty to the king over his loyalty to me, to our future." Nicholas listened intently, his expression softening as he heard her story. He understood now, the source of her strength, her resilience, her ability to empathize with his own pain. "It is a heavy burden," he said, "to carry such a loss, such a betrayal." "It is," Emmeline agreed. "But it has also taught me about the complexities of love and loyalty, about the choices we make and the consequences we face." A silence fell between them, filled only by the crackling of the fire. Emmeline felt a connection to Nicholas in that moment, a shared understanding of pain and loss that transcended their forced marriage, their initial animosity. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. His touch sent a shiver down her spine, a sensation both familiar and unsettling. "You are strong, Emmeline," he said, his voice a low murmur. "Stronger than you know." She met his gaze, her own emotions a swirling mix of vulnerability and a growing affection. "And you, Nicholas," she said, "are not as alone as you think." He leaned in, his lips brushing against her forehead, a chaste kiss, a gesture of comfort and reassurance. It was a moment of unexpected intimacy, a sign of the deepening bond between them. As the days passed, Nicholas slowly began to emerge from his self-imposed isolation. Emmeline's unwavering support, her understanding and empathy helped him to heal, to come to terms with Isolde's betrayal, and to regain his confidence. He started to include her more fully in his counsels, seeking her advice on matters of state, valuing her judgment and her insights. He also began to open up to her more, sharing his thoughts, his fears, his hopes for the future. Their relationship, once defined by duty and animosity, was gradually transforming into something deeper, something more meaningful. They were still navigating the complexities of their forced marriage, still grappling with the shadows of the past, but they were doing it together, as partners, as allies, perhaps even as friends. One evening, as they walked together in the gardens, the scent of roses heavy in the air, Nicholas turned to Emmeline, his expression serious. "I have been thinking," he said, "about Briarhall. About your brother, Thomas." Emmeline's heart quickened. This was a topic they had touched upon before, but never fully explored. "What about him?" she asked, her voice cautious. "He is still an enemy," Nicholas said. "At least, in the eyes of the king, in the eyes of many of my own people." "He is my brother," Emmeline said, her voice firm. "And he is no threat to you, Nicholas. He wants only to rebuild his lands, to protect his people." Nicholas nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "I believe you," he said. "But it is a delicate situation. A peace between Warwick and Briarhall, it would require a significant gesture, a sign of trust." Emmeline's mind raced. What gesture could possibly bridge the chasm of mistrust and animosity between their two houses? An idea, bold and daring, began to form in her mind. It was a risky proposition, one that could easily backfire, but it was also the only path she could see that might lead to a lasting peace. She took a deep breath. "I have a suggestion," she said, with a steady voice that hid the pounding of her heart. It was more than a suggestion. It was a gamble. Chapter 13. A Knight's Confession. Emmeline's suggestion was audacious, a proposal that could either forge a lasting peace between Warwick and Briarhall or shatter the fragile truce they had so carefully constructed. She proposed a formal alliance, sealed not by political maneuvering or royal decree, but by a personal bond, a gesture of trust that would transcend the years of animosity. She proposed that her brother, Thomas, be invited to Castle Draken, not as a prisoner or a supplicant, but as an honored guest, a potential ally. She further suggested a tournament, a display of knightly skill and prowess, where the warriors of Warwick and Briarhall could compete, not as enemies, but as rivals, testing their strength and courage in a controlled environment. It was a risky proposition, one that could easily be misinterpreted, that could spark renewed conflict rather than foster reconciliation. But Emmeline believed it was the only way to break the cycle of hatred and distrust, to demonstrate a genuine commitment to peace. Nicholas, initially stunned by the boldness of her plan, listened intently, his expression shifting from surprise to thoughtful consideration. He recognized the inherent risks, the potential for backlash from his own people, the possibility of treachery from Thomas. But he also saw the potential benefits, the chance to forge a lasting peace, to secure his borders, to unite their two houses against common enemies. "It is a daring proposal, Emmeline," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of apprehension and admiration. "Are you certain it is wise?" "I am," Emmeline replied, her voice firm and resolute. "I know my brother. He is a man of honor, and he desires peace as much as we do. But he needs to see a sign of good faith, a gesture of trust. And what if he betrays that trust?" Nicholas asked, his gaze searching hers. "What if this is a ruse, a way to gain access to Draken, to weaken our defenses?" Emmeline met his gaze unflinchingly. "Then we will deal with it," she said. "But I believe in my brother, Nicholas. I believe in his desire for peace. And I believe in you, in your ability to judge men's hearts." Nicholas sighed, running a hand through his hair, his face etched with conflict. He was torn between his caution, his ingrained distrust of the Briarhalls, and his growing respect for Emmeline, his belief in her judgment. "Very well," he said, his voice finally resolving into a decision. "We will do it. We will invite Thomas to Draken. We will hold a tournament. But we will also be vigilant. We will take every precaution to ensure the safety of the castle, of our people." Emmeline felt a surge of relief, mingled with a sense of trepidation. She had won Nicholas's approval, but the true test was yet to come. Preparations for the tournament and Thomas's visit began immediately. The castle buzzed with activity, as arrangements were made for the accommodation of the Briarhall guests, the construction of the lists, and the organization of the various events. Nicholas, despite his initial reservations, threw himself into the preparations with his usual energy and determination. He oversaw every detail, ensuring that everything was perfect, that the tournament would be a fitting display of Warwick hospitality and strength. He also spent hours with Emmeline, discussing the protocols, the seating arrangements, the various nuances of courtly etiquette. He valued her insights, her knowledge of her brother's temperament, her understanding of the delicate balance of power and diplomacy. One evening, as they were working late in the library, poring over the guest lists and the tournament schedule, Nicholas paused, his gaze turning to Emmeline, his expression unusually soft. "You know, Emmeline," he said, I have never spoken of this to anyone before." Emmeline looked at him, surprised by his sudden shift in tone, by the vulnerability in his eyes. "Of what, Nicholas?"
she asked.
He hesitated, then, with a deep breath, he began to speak. He told her about his first love, a woman named Lyra, a noblewoman from a neighboring kingdom. He had been deeply in love with her, and they had been betrothed to be married. But during a border skirmish, Lyra had been captured by a rival lord, a cruel and ruthless man who had demanded a king's ransom for her release. Nicholas, desperate to save her, had gathered all the wealth he could, but it had not been enough. Lyra had been killed, her body returned to Nicholas, a brutal message of defiance and contempt. He had been devastated, his heart broken, his spirit crushed. He had vowed never to love again, to devote himself solely to the defense of his lands, to the protection of his people. "I built walls around my heart, Emmeline," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "Walls of duty, of responsibility, of fear. I believed that love was a weakness, a vulnerability that I could not afford." Emmeline listened intently, her heart aching for him, for the pain he had endured, for the loss he had suffered. She understood now, the source of his initial coldness, his detachment, his reluctance to open himself to her. "But you, Emmeline," he continued, his gaze locking with hers. "You have shown me that love is not a weakness. It is a strength. It is a source of courage, of resilience, of hope." He reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. His touch sent a shiver down her spine, a sensation both familiar and intensely powerful. I am falling in love with you, Emmeline," he said, his voice a low murmur, his eyes filled with a tenderness that took her breath away. His confession, raw and unexpected, stunned her. She had sensed the growing affection between them, the deepening bond, but she had not dared to hope for such a declaration.
She stammered.
Words failed her. She had, without a doubt, come to love him, but she had never imagined hearing it. He smiled, a faint, knowing smile, and leaned and he placed a kiss, soft and lingering, upon her lips. It was a kiss of confession. It spoke, and she now heard, the language of the heart. Chapter 14. The Unveiling of Secrets. Thomas of Briarhall arrived at Castle Draken with a retinue of 50 men, a mixture of seasoned warriors and younger knights eager to prove their mettle in the upcoming tournament. The atmosphere was tense, charged with a mixture of anticipation and underlying suspicion. The Warwick soldiers, though outwardly courteous, eyed the Briarhall men with a wary caution, their hands never far from their swords. Emmeline, standing beside Nicholas on the battlements, watched as her brother rode through the castle gates, his head held high, his expression proud but unyielding. She felt a surge of conflicting emotions, relief at seeing him safe, apprehension about the days to come, and a fierce determination to make this alliance work. Thomas dismounted, his gaze sweeping the courtyard, taking in the imposing strength of Castle Draken, the watchful faces of the Warwick soldiers. He spotted Emmeline and Nicholas, and a flicker of warmth crossed his face, a brief smile that eased some of the tension. He approached them, bowing low to Nicholas, a gesture of respect, but also of defiance. "Lord Warwick," he said, his voice clear and strong, "I thank you for your hospitality." Nicholas returned the bow, his expression carefully neutral. "Lord Thomas," he said, "you are welcome at Draken. I trust your journey was uneventful." "It was," Thomas replied. "Though I confess, I never thought to see the day when a Briarhall would be welcomed within these walls."
"Times change," Nicholas said.
"And with them, so must we. We have been enemies for too long, Thomas. It is time to find a new path, a path of peace." Thomas met his gaze, his eyes searching Nicholas's, assessing his sincerity. "Those are fine words, Lord Warwick," he said. "But words are easily spoken. Deeds are what matter." "And deeds you shall have," Nicholas replied. "The tournament will be a test, not just of strength and skill, but of honor and trust. Let us see if the warriors of Warwick and Briarhall can compete as rivals, not as enemies." Thomas nodded, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. "I accept your challenge, Lord Warwick," he said. "Let the games begin." The tournament was a grand affair, lasting for 3 days, filled with jousting, melee combat, archery, and various other displays of knightly prowess. The warriors of Warwick and Briarhall competed fiercely, their rivalry evident, but their conduct, for the most part, remained honorable. Emmeline watched the events with a mixture of pride and anxiety. She cheered for her brother and his men, but she also found herself admiring the skill and courage of the Warwick knights, including Nicholas, who participated in several events, displaying his own formidable abilities. The evenings were filled with feasting and entertainment, a chance for the two houses to mingle, to share stories, to begin to bridge the gap of mistrust and animosity. Emmeline worked tirelessly to foster a sense of camaraderie, to encourage conversation and understanding between the two groups. She also spent time with her brother, catching up on news from Briarhall, sharing her experiences at Draken, and trying to reassure him about Nicholas's intentions. "He is a good man, Thomas," she said, one evening as they sat together in the gardens. "He is not what you think. He truly desires peace." Thomas looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "I see a change in you, Emmeline," he said. You seem happy here." Emmeline blushed, surprised by his observation. I am finding my place, Thomas," she said. "It is not the life I envisioned, but it is a life with purpose. And with Nicholas." Thomas nodded, his gaze softening. "I am glad for you, sister," he said. "You deserve happiness. And if Warwick can give you that, then perhaps there is hope for us all." But despite the outward appearances of harmony, a sense of unease lingered beneath the surface. Emmeline sensed a subtle resistance from some of the Warwick retainers, a lingering suspicion of the Briarhalls that even the tournament and the feasting could not fully dispel. Agnes, her ever-watchful nurse, confirmed her suspicions. "There is talk, my lady," she said. "Whispers of discontent. Some still believe this alliance is a mistake, a betrayal of the old ways." Emmeline sighed. She had known this would not be easy. Old hatreds died hard, and trust was a fragile thing, easily broken. One evening, during a lull in the festivities, Emmeline discovered a hidden passage behind a tapestry in the great hall. Curiosity piqued. She followed the passage, which led to a small, dusty chamber, filled with old documents and forgotten relics. As she was examining the contents of the chamber, she stumbled upon a hidden compartment, concealed behind a loose stone in the wall. Inside, she found a collection of letters, bound together with a faded ribbon. The letters were old, their ink faded, their script difficult to decipher. But as Emmeline began to read them, a chilling realization dawned upon her. The letters were correspondence between Isolde and Lord Kenric, dating back several years, long before the recent siege of Draken. The letters revealed a long-standing conspiracy, a plot between Isolde and Kenric to destabilize the Warwick rule, to weaken Nicholas's position and ultimately to seize control of Draken. Isolde had been feeding Kenric information, advising him on strategy, and even promising him support from within the castle walls. Emmeline's heart pounded in her chest as she read the damning evidence. Isolde's treachery ran far deeper than she had ever imagined. It was not just a recent plot against Emmeline, but a long-standing conspiracy against Nicholas, against the entire Warwick house. She carefully replaced the letters, her mind racing. She had to show these to Nicholas, to reveal the full extent of Isolde's betrayal. But she also knew she had to be careful. The discovery of these letters could have unintended consequences, could reignite old tensions, could even jeopardize the fragile alliance with Briarhall. She returned to the great hall, her heart heavy with the weight of her discovery. She found Nicholas and Thomas engaged in conversation, their manner surprisingly cordial, Their discussion focused on the future, on the possibilities of cooperation between their two houses. She waited until Thomas excused himself. Then she revealed it all to him. The full depths of the betrayal were unveiled. Chapter 15. Beneath a Sky of Storms. The revelation of Isolde's long-standing conspiracy with Lord Kenric sent a shockwave through Nicholas, far deeper and more profound than the previous discovery of her attempt to manipulate his marriage. This was not just a personal betrayal, a scheme born of resentment and ambition. It was a calculated, sustained effort to undermine his rule, to endanger his people, to betray everything he held sacred. He read the letters, his face paling with each damning word, his hands trembling with a mixture of rage and disbelief. The evidence was irrefutable, the extent of Isolde's treachery staggering. She had not just plotted against Emmeline, she had plotted against him, against his father, against the entire Warwick legacy. I cannot believe it," he stammered, his voice choked with emotion. "All these years she was working with Kenric against us." Emmeline watched him, her heart aching for his pain, for the shattering of his illusions. She knew the depth of his affection for Isolde, the trust he had placed in her, and the devastation he must be feeling. "I am so sorry, Nicholas," she said, her voice soft with empathy. "I know this is difficult." He looked at her, his gray eyes filled with a torment that mirrored the storm raging within him. "She was like a mother to me," he said. "After my own mother died, she was the one who cared for me, who guided me." "I know," Emmeline said. "But she betrayed that trust, Nicholas. She betrayed you. She betrayed your father's memory. She betrayed your people." He sighed, running a hand through his hair, his face etched with a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. "What am I to do, Emmeline?" he asked. "What am I to do now?" Emmeline hesitated, considering her words carefully. She knew that Nicholas's reaction to this revelation could have far-reaching consequences, not just for Isolde, but for the fragile alliance with Briarhall, for the stability of the entire region. "You must act with justice, Nicholas," she said, "but also with wisdom. This news, it cannot remain hidden, but it must be revealed in a way that minimizes the damage, that preserves the peace we have so carefully worked to build." Nicholas nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "You are right," he said. "But how? How do I reveal this treachery without sparking renewed conflict, without shattering the trust we have established with Thomas, with my own people?" Emmeline had anticipated this question, and she had a plan. It was a risky plan, one that required careful timing and precise execution, but it was the only path she could see that might lead to a just and lasting resolution. "We must reveal it to everyone," she said. "To Thomas, to your council, to the assembled guests. We must lay bare Isolde's treachery, but we must also emphasize that it was her act alone, that it does not reflect on the honor of the Warwicks, nor does it diminish our commitment to peace with Briarhall." Nicholas looked at her, his expression a mixture of apprehension and admiration. "It is a bold move, Emmeline," he said, "and a dangerous one. But I trust you. I trust your judgment." They agreed to reveal the truth the following day, during the final feast of the tournament, when all the guests, both Warwick and Briarhall, would be assembled in the Great Hall. The atmosphere at the feast was initially festive, the air filled with laughter and conversation, the tables laden with food and drink. But as Nicholas rose to address the assembled guests, a hush fell over the room, a sense of anticipation, of something momentous about to occur. He began by speaking of the success of the tournament, of the skill and courage displayed by the warriors of both Warwick and Briarhall, of the growing understanding and respect between their two houses. Then his tone shifted, his expression turning grave. He spoke of betrayal, of treachery, of a darkness that had lurked within the walls of Draken for far too long. He revealed Isolde's long-standing conspiracy with Lord Kenric, her deliberate attempts to undermine his rule, to sabotage the peace, to betray her own family. He produced the letters, the damning evidence of her guilt, and he read them aloud, his voice ringing with a mixture of anger and sorrow. The reaction from the assembled guests was one of shock and disbelief. The Warwick retainers, those who had been loyal to Isolde, were stunned, their faces paling with horror. The Briar Hall men, initially wary, exchanged uneasy glances, their suspicions seemingly confirmed. Thomas rose from his seat, his face a mask of controlled fury. "Is this true, Lord Warwick?" he demanded. "Has your own aunt been plotting with our enemy?" Nicholas met his gaze unflinchingly.
"It is true, Lord Thomas," he said.
"And I am as shocked and as outraged as you are. But I swear to you on my honor, on the honor of the Warwicks, that Isolde acted alone. This treachery does not reflect on my people, nor does it diminish my commitment to peace with Briar Hall." He turned to Emmeline, his gaze seeking hers, a silent plea for support. Emmeline rose, her head held high, her expression resolute. "My brother," she said, her voice clear and strong, addressing Thomas. "I know this is difficult to believe, but I have seen the evidence. I have seen Nicholas's heart. He is a man of honor, and he desires peace as much as you do. Do not let Isolde's treachery destroy what we have so carefully built." Thomas hesitated, his gaze shifting between Nicholas and Emmeline, his mind clearly wrestling with conflicting emotions. Then slowly he nodded. "I believe you, sister," he said. "And I trust you, Lord Warwick. But know this. If this is a trick, if this is a way to weaken us, to betray us, there will be consequences." "There will be no trickery, Lord Thomas," Nicholas said. "Only truth, and a commitment to a lasting peace." The feast continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. The initial joy and camaraderie had been replaced by a sense of somber reflection, of cautious hope. The unveiling of secrets had been a necessary step, but it had also opened old wounds, reignited old suspicions. As a storm raged outside, mirroring the tumult within the castle, Nicholas stood with his hand on Emmeline's, a small symbol of unity. They had weathered one storm, but more were surely coming. Chapter 16. Trials of the Heart. The aftermath of Isolde's exposed treachery and Thomas's visit was a period of delicate readjustment. While the alliance between Warwick and Briar Hall had survived the initial shock, the foundations remained fragile, requiring constant nurturing and reassurance. Nicholas, burdened by the weight of his aunt's betrayal and the ongoing need to maintain peace, found himself increasingly reliant on Emmeline's counsel and support. Their relationship, once defined by duty and a forced marriage, had blossomed into something far deeper. Nicholas's confession of love, though a pivotal moment, was only the beginning of a journey fraught with challenges, both internal and external. They were navigating uncharted territory, forging a bond built on mutual respect, growing affection, and a shared commitment to a future that remained uncertain. Emmeline, despite her own happiness at Nicholas's declaration, found herself grappling with lingering doubts and insecurities. The scars of her past betrothal, the memory of Rowan's betrayal, still haunted her, making it difficult to fully surrender to the love that was blossoming between them. She feared vulnerability, feared the pain of another loss, and she struggled to reconcile her feelings for Nicholas with the lingering shadows of her past. One evening, as they sat together in the gardens, the scent of night-blooming jasmine heavy in the air, Emmeline turned to Nicholas, her expression troubled. "Nicholas," she said, her voice hesitant, I need to ask you something." He looked at her, his gray eyes filled with concern. "What is it, Emmeline?" he asked.
"What troubles you?" "It's about the past," she said.
"About Rowan. About my previous betrothal." Nicholas's expression softened, understanding dawning in his eyes. "You do not need to speak of it, Emmeline," he said.
"If it pains you know," she said.
"I need to. I need you to understand why I sometimes hold back, why I struggle to fully trust." He nodded, his gaze encouraging her to continue. She told him about Rowan, about their childhood together, about the plans they had made, about the love she had felt for him. She told him about his betrayal, about his death, about the pain and the confusion she had carried with her ever since. I fear that history will repeat itself," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "That I will give my heart to someone, only to have it broken again." Nicholas listened intently, his heart aching for her pain, for the vulnerability she was revealing. He reached out, his hand gently covering hers, his touch sending a wave of warmth through her. "Emmeline," he said, his voice a low murmur. "I am not Rowan. I would never betray you. I would never choose duty, or anything else, over my love for you." She met his gaze, her eyes searching his, seeking reassurance, seeking a promise that he could keep. "I know you believe that, Nicholas," she said. "But can you truly promise me that? Can you promise me that you will always choose love over everything else?" He hesitated, his expression turning thoughtful. "I cannot promise you that, Emmeline," he said, "because I am a lord, a ruler. I have responsibilities, duties that I cannot ignore. There may come a time when I have to make a difficult choice, a choice that may hurt you, that may test our love." His honesty, though painful, was also a relief. He was not offering her empty promises, false reassurances. He was acknowledging the realities of their lives, the challenges they would inevitably face. "But I can promise you this," he continued, his gaze locking with hers. "I will always strive to do what is right, not just for my people, but for us. I will always consider your feelings, your needs, your happiness. And I will always love you, Emmeline. With all my heart, with all my soul." His words, spoken with such sincerity, such conviction, touched her deeply. She realized that she could not ask for more than that. She could not expect him to abandon his responsibilities, to ignore his duty. But she could trust him to love her, to cherish her, to always strive to do what was right, even when it was difficult. She leaned in, her lips meeting his in a kiss that sealed their unspoken vows, a kiss that spoke of trust, of understanding, of a love that was growing stronger with each passing day. The trials were far from over. Emmeline, with Nicola's support, took on increasing responsibilities. The running of the castle, once a task of a stranger, was now her own. And she excelled at it, with her natural sense of diplomacy and a firmness, too, that seemed to increase. She also began to work for the further strengthening of the alliance. She proposed trade and mutual defense pacts, and she worked with Nicholas on the matters of the heart. They would often spend the evenings talking, but they would also spend nights together, the walls of their hearts and of the castle bedroom finally crumbling. But love, like a kingdom, needed constant care. Chapter 17. The Lioness Awakens. As Emmeline settled more deeply into her role as Lady of Draken, she began to assert her influence, not just within the castle walls, but also in the wider political landscape. Her intelligence, her diplomatic skills, and her growing understanding of the complexities of power made her an invaluable asset to Nicholas, a trusted advisor and a formidable advocate for their shared interests. She took a particular interest in fostering closer ties with Briarhall, working tirelessly to overcome the lingering suspicions and resentments that still simmered beneath the surface of the newly forged alliance. She encouraged trade between the two houses, organized joint training exercises for their warriors, and even arranged for cultural exchanges, inviting musicians, scholars, and artisans from Briarhall to visit Draken, and vice versa. Her efforts were not always met with enthusiasm. Some of the older Warwick retainers, still clinging to the old ways, viewed her initiatives with suspicion, seeing them as a betrayal of their traditions, a weakening of their strength. They whispered their discontent in the corridors, casting doubt on her motives, questioning her loyalty. Emmeline, aware of their resistance, refused to be deterred. She knew that building a lasting peace required patience, perseverance, and a willingness to confront opposition head-on. She met with the dissenting voices, listened to their concerns, and patiently explained her vision for a future where Warwick and Briarhall could stand together, not as enemies, but as allies. She also used her growing influence with Nicholas to advocate for policies that benefited both houses, promoting trade, encouraging infrastructure development, and working to improve the lives of the common people. She became known as a champion of the poor and the vulnerable, a voice for justice and compassion in a world often characterized by brutality and indifference. Her actions earned her the respect and admiration of many, both within Draken and beyond. The common folk hailed her as Emmeline the Just, a leader who cared for their welfare, a woman of strength and wisdom. Even some of her initial detractors began to soften their stance, recognizing her genuine commitment to the well-being of the people. But her growing power and influence also attracted new enemies. Lord Mortine, a neighboring lord with a long-standing rivalry with the Warwicks, saw Emmeline's efforts to strengthen the alliance with Briarhall as a threat to his own ambitions. He began to spread rumors, whispering doubts about her loyalty, suggesting that she was secretly plotting to undermine Nicholas's rule, to seize control of Draken for her own family. Morton's whispers reached the ears of King Alaric, who, weakened by years of conflict and increasingly paranoid, began to question Emmeline's motives. He summoned Nicholas and Emmeline to court, demanding an explanation for their actions, an assurance of their continued loyalty. Emmeline, aware of the danger, prepared carefully for their visit to the royal court. She knew that she would be facing not just the king's suspicions, but also the machinations of Mortine and other rivals who sought to exploit the situation for their own gain. She and Nicholas traveled to the capital, accompanied by a small retinue of their most trusted guards. The atmosphere at court was tense, charged with intrigue and suspicion. Emmeline found herself the subject of whispered conversations, of covert glances, of thinly veiled accusations. She met with the king, her head held high, her expression resolute. She defended her actions, explaining her commitment to peace, her desire to strengthen the alliance between Warwick and Briarhall, her loyalty to Nicholas and to the crown. But the king, influenced by Morton's whispers and his own growing paranoia, remained unconvinced. He demanded that Emmeline prove her loyalty, that she renounce her ties to Briarhall, that she swear an oath of fealty to him alone. Emmeline refused. She would not betray her brother, she would not abandon her commitment to peace, and she would not bow to the king's unreasonable demands. "I am Lady of Draken," she declared, her voice ringing out through the court. "My loyalty is to my husband, to my people, and to the principles of justice and compassion. I will not renounce my family, I will not abandon my beliefs, and I will not be intimidated by your threats." Her defiance stunned the court. No one dared to challenge the king so openly, so fearlessly. A hush fell over the room, the air thick with tension. Nicholas, witnessing Emmeline's courage, felt a surge of pride and admiration. He stepped forward, his hand reaching out to take hers, a gesture of solidarity and support. "My wife speaks the truth, Your Majesty," he said, his voice firm and resolute. "She is a woman of honor, a woman of principle, and she is a loyal servant of the crown. But she will not be bullied, she will not be coerced, and she will not betray her own conscience." The king, enraged by their defiance, threatened them with imprisonment, with confiscation of their lands, with even worse punishments. But Nicholas and Emmeline stood firm, their united front a powerful symbol of their love, their loyalty, and their unwavering commitment to their beliefs. It was clear that their trials were far from over. The king was not convinced, and new alliances were forming. Alliances against them. But as Emmeline looked at Nicholas, and as he returned the gaze, she knew that she had awakened. She was no longer just a lady or a dove. She was a lioness, and her roar would echo through the kingdom. Chapter 18. Shadows of Allegiance. The confrontation with King Alaric marked a turning point in Emmeline and Nicholas's relationship and in their position within the volatile political landscape of the kingdom. Their defiance of the king, though born of principle and a commitment to their beliefs, had earned them powerful enemies and cast a shadow of uncertainty over their future. They returned to Draken, aware that they were walking a precarious path, surrounded by rivals who sought to exploit their vulnerability, to undermine their power, to destroy the fragile peace they had so carefully constructed. The whispers of discontent, fueled by Lord Mortine and others who saw Emmeline as a threat, grew louder, reaching the ears of even their most loyal supporters. Nicholas, burdened by the weight of his responsibilities and the growing threat to their safety, became increasingly withdrawn, his usual confidence shaken, his spirit burdened by the constant pressure. He spent hours poring over maps and military reports, strengthening Draken's defenses, preparing for the inevitable conflict that loomed on the horizon. Emmeline, witnessing his struggles, felt a surge of determination to stand by his side, to share his burdens, to fight for the future they had so bravely envisioned. She redoubled her efforts to strengthen the alliance with Briarhall, reaching out to Thomas, seeking his continued support and counsel. She also began to cultivate relationships with other lords and ladies who were wary of the king's growing instability and Morton's increasing influence. She used her diplomatic skills, her charm, and her reputation for justice and compassion to forge alliances, to build a network of support that could protect them from their enemies. One evening, as they sat together in the library, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows on the walls, Emmeline turned to Nicholas, her expression serious. "We cannot stand alone, Nicholas," she said. "We need allies, strong allies, who will stand with us against the king, against Mortine, against all those who seek to destroy us." Nicholas nodded, his gaze troubled. "I know, Emmeline," he said, "but who can we trust? Who will risk the king's wrath to support us?" Emmeline had been giving this matter considerable thought, and she had a plan. It was a risky plan, one that required reaching out to an unlikely ally, a lord with a reputation for independence and a history of conflict with the crown. "Lord Gareth of Blackwood," she said. "He is a powerful lord, with a strong army and a strategic location. He has also clashed with the king in the past, and he is known for his independent spirit. If we can win his support, we will have a formidable ally." Nicholas looked at her, his expression a mixture of surprise and skepticism. "Blackwood?" he said. "He is a wild card, Emmeline. Unpredictable, dangerous. Can we truly trust him?" "We have no choice, Nicholas," Emmeline said. "We need his strength, his resources, his strategic position. And I believe I can persuade him. I believe I can appeal to his sense of honor, his desire for justice, his own ambition." Nicholas hesitated. Then, with a sigh, he nodded. "Very well," he said. "We will reach out to Blackwood. But we will do it carefully, cautiously. We cannot afford to make any mistakes." Emmeline, with Nicholas's approval, sent a message to Lord Gareth, requesting a meeting, a secret rendezvous where they could discuss matters of mutual interest. The response was swift and affirmative. Blackwood agreed to meet them at a neutral location, a secluded hunting lodge deep within the forest. The journey to the meeting place was fraught with danger. Emmeline and Nicholas traveled with a small escort of their most trusted guards, their senses on high alert, aware that they could be ambushed at any moment. They arrived at the hunting lodge, a rustic structure surrounded by towering trees, the air filled with the scent of pine and the sound of rustling leaves. Lord Gareth awaited them, a tall, imposing figure with piercing blue eyes and a weathered face that spoke of a life lived on the edge. The meeting was tense, filled with cautious pronouncements and veiled threats. Blackwood was a shrewd negotiator, a man who weighed his options carefully, who was not easily swayed by sentiment or promises. Emmeline, taking the lead in the negotiations, spoke eloquently of their shared concerns, of the king's growing instability, of Morton's ambition, of the need for strong leaders to stand together against tyranny and injustice. She appealed to Blackwood's sense of honor, his desire for independence, his own ambition for power and influence. Nicholas, though initially skeptical, supported Emmeline's efforts, adding his own voice to the negotiations, emphasizing the strategic advantages of an alliance, the strength they could achieve together. After hours of intense discussion, Blackwood finally agreed to join their cause. He pledged his support, his resources, his army, to their fight against the king and Mortine. But he also made it clear that his loyalty was conditional, that he expected to be treated as an equal partner, that he would not hesitate to withdraw his support if he felt betrayed or marginalized. The alliance with Blackwood, though a significant victory, was also a gamble. They had gained a powerful ally, but they had also taken on a dangerous and unpredictable partner. The shadows of allegiance were complex, shifting, and potentially deadly. Emmeline and Nicholas returned to Draken. They were victorious for the moment, but they were aware the game had changed. They had a new player, and he was playing for keeps. Chapter 19. A Kingdom Divided. The alliance with Lord Gareth of Blackwood proved to be a turning point in the escalating conflict with King Alaric and Lord Mortine. Blackwood's forces, combined with those of Warwick and Briarhall, created a formidable coalition, a power block that could challenge the king's authority and disrupt Morton's ambitions. News of the alliance spread quickly throughout the kingdom, sending shockwaves through the court and sparking a wave of unrest and uncertainty. Lords and ladies who had been hesitant to openly oppose the king now began to reconsider their positions, weighing their options, calculating their allegiances. King Alaric, enraged by Blackwood's defection and the growing strength of the rebel alliance, responded with characteristic brutality. He declared Nicholas, Emmeline, Thomas, and Gareth traitors, stripped them of their titles and lands, and ordered their arrest and execution. He also sent his army, led by Lord Mortine, to crush the rebellion, to bring the defiant lords to heel. The kingdom was plunged into open warfare. Battles raged across the land as the king's forces clashed with the rebel alliance. Castles were besieged, villages were burned, and the countryside was ravaged by the conflict. Emmeline, despite her initial reluctance to resort to violence, found herself playing an increasingly active role in the war effort. She used her diplomatic skills to rally support for their cause, negotiating with wavering lords, securing supplies and resources, and coordinating the movements of their troops. She also insisted on accompanying Nicholas on the battlefield, refusing to be confined to the safety of Draken. She rode alongside him, dressed in light armor, her presence a source of inspiration to their soldiers, a symbol of her unwavering commitment to their cause. She witnessed the horrors of war firsthand, the carnage, the suffering, the senseless destruction. But she also saw the courage, the resilience, the unwavering loyalty of their people, their willingness to fight for their freedom, for their homes, for their future. One evening, as they camped on a windswept hillside, overlooking a valley where a fierce battle had raged earlier that day, Emmeline turned to Nicholas, her face etched with a mixture of sorrow and determination. "This war, it is tearing the kingdom apart," she said, her voice barely a whisper above the wind. "Is there no other way, Nicholas? No way to end this bloodshed?" Nicholas looked at her, his gray eyes filled with a weariness that mirrored her own. "I wish there were, Emmeline," he said. "But Alaric is driven by paranoia and vengeance. Mortine is fueled by ambition and greed. They will not listen to reason. They will not negotiate. They will only understand force." "But at what cost, Nicholas?" Emmeline asked. "How many lives must be lost? How much destruction must be wrought before this madness ends?" Nicholas sighed, running a hand through his hair, his face etched with the burden of his responsibilities. "I do not know, Emmeline," he said. "I do not know. But I do know this. We cannot surrender. We cannot allow tyranny to triumph. We must fight for what we believe in, for the future we want for our people, for the love we share." He reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. His touch sent a shiver down her spine, a reminder of the bond that held them together, the love that gave them strength in the face of adversity. "We will win this war, Emmeline," he said, his voice firm and resolute. "We will defeat Alaric and Mortine. We will build a new kingdom, a better kingdom, founded on justice, on compassion, on peace." His words, spoken with such conviction, filled her with a renewed sense of hope, a determination to fight alongside him, to see their vision through to the end. The war raged on for months, for years. There were victories and defeats, moments of triumph and despair. The rebel alliance, though outnumbered and outgunned, fought with courage and determination, their spirit fueled by their belief in their cause, by their loyalty to Nicholas and Emmeline. The final, decisive battle took place on the plains before the capital, a vast, open field where the fate of the kingdom would be decided. The two armies clashed in a brutal, bloody melee, the air filled with the sounds of steel on steel, the cries of the wounded, the roar of battle. Nicholas, leading his troops from the front, fought with the ferocity of a cornered wolf, his sword a blur of motion, cutting down his enemies with ruthless efficiency. Emmeline, riding beside him, witnessed his courage, his determination, his unwavering commitment to their cause. She also saw the danger he was in, the constant threat of death that surrounded him. She feared for his life, for their future, for the love they shared. As the battle reached its climax, Nicholas found himself face to face with Lord Mortine, his sworn enemy, the man who had fueled the king's paranoia, the architect of so much of their suffering. They engaged in a fierce duel, their swords clashing, their bodies straining, their hatred for each other palpable. Mortine, a skilled warrior, fought with a desperate fury, driven by his ambition, by his desire to crush Nicholas and seize control of the kingdom. But Nicholas, fueled by his love for Emmeline, by his commitment to his people, by his unwavering belief in their cause, fought with a strength and a determination that Mortine could not match. He disarmed Mortine, his sword pointing at the throat of his fallen enemy. He could have killed him, could have ended his life with a single stroke. But he hesitated. Emmeline, watching from the sidelines, held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew that Nicholas was capable of killing Mortine, that he had every right to do so. But she also knew that he was a man of honor, a man of compassion, a man who sought to build a better world, a world not founded on vengeance and bloodshed. Nicholas lowered his sword. "I will not kill you, Mortine," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of contempt and pity. "Your life is not mine to take. You will be judged by the law, by the people you have wronged." Mortine, stunned by Nicholas's mercy, stared up at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and grudging respect. With Morton's capture, the battle turned decisively in favor of the rebel alliance. The king's forces, demoralized and leaderless, began to surrender, their resistance crumbling. King Alaric, witnessing the defeat of his army, his kingdom slipping away from his grasp, took his own life, rather than face the consequences of his actions. The kingdom was free, but it was shattered. The war had been won, but at a great cost. Chapter 20. The Reckoning of Love and Duty. With the death of King Alaric and the capture of Lord Mortine, the war that had ravaged the kingdom finally came to an end. The rebel alliance, victorious but weary, faced the daunting task of rebuilding a shattered nation, of healing the wounds of conflict, of forging a new future from the ashes of the old. Nicholas, as the leader of the victorious coalition, was acclaimed by many as the rightful heir to the throne. He had proven his strength, his courage, his leadership abilities, and his commitment to justice and compassion. But he was reluctant to simply seize power, to perpetuate the cycle of violence and usurpation that had plagued the kingdom for so long. He called for a great council, a gathering of lords and ladies from across the land, to decide the future of the kingdom, to choose a new ruler, to establish a new order. He invited representatives from all factions, including those who had fought against him, offering them amnesty and a chance to participate in the shaping of the new realm. Emmeline, standing by his side, supported his decision, recognizing the wisdom in his approach. She knew that a lasting peace could not be built on force alone, that it required consensus, cooperation, and a willingness to forgive the past. The great council convened in the capital, in the very hall where Emmeline had once defied King Alaric, where she had declared her loyalty to Nicholas and to her principles. The atmosphere was tense, filled with a mixture of hope and apprehension, as the representatives of the various factions gathered to deliberate the fate of the kingdom. Nicholas, addressing the assembled lords and ladies, spoke eloquently of the need for unity, for reconciliation, for a new beginning. He renounced any claim to the throne based on conquest, offering himself instead as a candidate to be judged on his merits, on his commitment to justice and the well-being of the people. Emmeline, too, addressed the council, her voice clear and strong, her words resonating with the assembled delegates. She spoke of the horrors of war, of the suffering she had witnessed, of the need to build a future where such conflicts would never again tear the kingdom apart. She spoke of her love for Nicholas, of her belief in his leadership, of her commitment to working alongside him to create a better world. The deliberations of the Great Council lasted for days, filled with passionate debate, political maneuvering, and moments of both tension and compromise. There were other claimants to the throne, ambitious lords who sought to exploit the situation for their own gain. But Nicholas, with Emmeline's unwavering support, gradually won over the majority of the delegates, convincing them of his sincerity, his vision, and his ability to lead. In the end, the Great Council voted overwhelmingly to offer Nicholas the crown, not as a conqueror, but as a chosen leader, a man entrusted with the responsibility of rebuilding the kingdom and guiding it towards a brighter future. Nicholas accepted the crown, not with a sense of triumph, but with a profound sense of humility and responsibility. He knew that the challenges ahead were immense, that the task of healing the wounds of war and forging a lasting peace would require all his strength, all his wisdom, all his love. He was crowned king, not in a lavish ceremony, but in a simple, solemn event, attended by representatives of all the people, rich and poor, noble and commoner. Emmeline, standing beside him, was crowned queen, not as a consort, but as a partner, a co-ruler, a woman recognized for her own strength, her own wisdom, her own contributions to their shared victory. Their reign began, not with a celebration of conquest, but with a commitment to justice, to compassion, to reconciliation. They established a new council, composed of representatives from all factions, to advise them on matters of state. They implemented reforms to the legal system, ensuring fair treatment for all citizens. They invested in infrastructure, rebuilding roads, bridges, and towns that had been destroyed during the war. They also worked tirelessly to heal the divisions between Warwick and Briarhall, fostering closer ties, encouraging trade and cultural exchange, and promoting a sense of shared identity and purpose. Thomas of Briarhall, now a trusted ally and advisor, played a key role in this reconciliation, his presence a symbol of the new era of peace and cooperation. Nicholas and Emmeline, despite the burdens of their royal duties, found time for each other, nurturing their love, strengthening their bond, their shared commitment to each other and to their people. They often walked together in the gardens, reminisced about their journey, and planned for the future. They were, against all odds, deeply and truly in love. One evening, as they stood on the battlements of Draken, overlooking the land they had fought so hard to protect, Nicholas turned to Emmeline, his gray eyes filled with a love that transcended all the trials and tribulations they had endured. "We did it, Emmeline," he said, his voice a soft murmur. "We built a new kingdom. Together." Emmeline smiled, her heart filled with a joy that was both profound and enduring. "Yes, Nicholas," she said. "We did. And we will continue to build it, together, for as long as we live." She leaned in, her lips meeting his in a kiss that sealed their love, their partnership, their shared destiny. It was a kiss of reckoning, a kiss of love, a kiss of duty fulfilled. It was like their lives and their future everything. Epilogue. Years passed, and the kingdom flourished under the wise and just rule of King Nicholas and Queen Emmeline. The scars of war gradually faded, replaced by a growing prosperity and a sense of shared purpose. The alliance between Warwick and Briarhall, once a fragile truce, blossomed into a lasting partnership, a testament to the vision and determination of two leaders who had chosen love and unity over hatred and division. Nicholas and Emmeline, though burdened by the responsibilities of their royal duties, remained deeply in love, their bond strengthened by the trials they had overcome, their commitment to each other unwavering. They ruled not as distant monarchs, but as active participants in the lives of their people, traveling throughout the kingdom, listening to their concerns, addressing their needs, and working tirelessly to improve their lives. Emmeline, in particular, became known for her compassion and her dedication to justice. She championed the rights of the poor and the vulnerable, established schools and hospitals, and promoted the arts and sciences, fostering a cultural renaissance that enriched the lives of all citizens. She was hailed as Emmeline the Good, a queen who embodied the ideals of kindness, wisdom, and unwavering devotion to her people. Nicholas, though a formidable warrior in his youth, proved to be an equally adept peacemaker, using his diplomatic skills to forge alliances with neighboring kingdoms, ensuring the long-term security and stability of the realm. He was respected and admired, not just for his strength, but for his fairness, his integrity, and his commitment to the rule of law. They had children, 2 sons and a daughter, heirs to the throne who inherited their parents' intelligence, their courage, and their deep sense of responsibility. The children were raised not in the isolation of the royal court, but amidst the people, learning from a young age the importance of service, of compassion, and of dedication to the common good. As the years turned into decades, Nicholas and Emmeline watched with pride as their children grew to adulthood, taking on increasing responsibilities in the governance of the kingdom. They saw their vision of a better world, a world founded on justice, peace, and unity, taking shape, becoming a reality. One evening, as they sat together on the battlements of Draken, the same spot where they had shared so many pivotal moments, their hair now streaked with silver, their faces etched with the lines of time and experience, Nicholas turned to Emmeline, his gray eyes filled with a love that had only deepened with the passing years. "We have had a good life, Emmeline," he said, his voice a soft murmur. "A life filled with challenges, with sorrows, but also with triumphs, with joy, with a love that has endured all things." Emmeline smiled, her heart overflowing with gratitude for the life they had shared, for the journey they had taken together. "Yes, Nicholas," she said. "We have. And I would not trade it for anything." He reached out, his hand gently taking hers, their fingers intertwining, a symbol of their unbreakable bond, their enduring partnership. They sat in silence, watching the sun set over the land they had fought so hard to protect, the land they had rebuilt together, the land that was now a testament to their love, their courage, and their unwavering commitment to a better future. They had found their home in each other. They found their peace together. Their duties were now legacies, and all debts had been paid, with their lives and with their love. The ending of the war had been a beginning of everything. And as the stars came out, a gentle wind whispered through the ancient stones of Draken. It sounded like a lullaby,